So my first question to understand French culture will be to you, Frederic. As you've worked as a diplomat for many years, your circumstances are a little bit different in the sense that Malaysian people who choose to work at the French embassy often have already a connection with French culture. And what are the things you think that they most enjoy about working with the French? And what are the things that they might find challenging working with you?
Bonjour to everybody. I'm really happy to be with you today. By definition, I'm going to be very biased in favor of French people because I'm paid for this. No, I'm just joking. I will try to bring a bit of my experience on the table as you ask. Look, people usually don't find it very challenging to work with me. I'm surprised that you even asked the question, but indeed, working in a French environment is something. It's a strong culture we have, I think. And when Malaysian colleagues arrive in a majority French people environment, such as an embassy of France anywhere in the world, that is not so easy. I think there are enjoyable elements, of course, about working with French companies or with a French embassy in a French environment. France is, after all, a relatively attractive country. It's a country where a lot of people want to travel to. We have the largest number of international tourists. So there's something about our country which is attractive. And in the work environment, from the economic perspective, we are a country of 67 million people, which is the 7th largest economy in the world. So we're not doing bad. There's something about it. But not only that, working in a French environment is enjoyable because of the French language. I think if you manage to learn a bit of it or be in contact a bit with the French language, then you have access not only to France, but to all the Francophone environments around the world. You know that there are 30 countries which have the French language as an official language, and more than 300 million locutors, people who speak French around the globe. I think that's also, being in that French environment, a gateway not only to France, but to that whole Francophone area. And it's a good investment. However, I would certainly agree with you that working in a multicultural environment has challenges, always. It's not specific to French, it's specific to wherever you are as a minority or wherever you have to join another culture in the workplace. There may be things that are quite difficult. And actually, before this seminar today, I ran a little opinion poll among my Malaysian colleagues at the French embassy. And the results may be a bit biased because I asked the question and they probably didn't dare answer entirely truthful things or spell out all the challenges they have. But one thing which I find is quite interesting and quite striking is the idea that for Malaysian people, working in the French environment means entering in a lot of debates and being asked to show critical thinking, which is a positive way of expressing things. But it also means being criticized probably a bit more directly and a bit more than you would in a Malaysian environment. French people in the culture have critical thinking at the heart. It's something that we learn at school. It's something that goes back to an Enlightenment period where being in doubt and being critical is very important, and we keep this. So working in the French environment may lead to the necessity to be critical yourself, but also accept criticism a bit more than in other environments. Just one example. Learning how to say no is another, and something that the Malaysians, generally speaking, don't do very much, and that in the French environment we may do quite a lot. However, I think one of the keys to answer these challenges is to, with the French in particular, be able to communicate, and that would probably be okay as well for any multicultural challenge. Sometimes we think that we understand each other, even when we know the language of the other side, maybe there are elements which are not so clear because of the cultural differences. So do not hesitate to enter in dialogue and to go a bit further to make sure that you understand and that you are understood.
First of all, thank you, Marie, because I think it's important for both cultures to make a step towards each other. So it's very important that the Malaysians understand also the way we behave, because it can create a lot of misunderstanding, stress in organizations. And I have seen that a lot in my past 20 years. The few examples, I may have a few to share, but I cannot tell you all of them. But the few I recall, one is very close to what the ambassador has mentioned earlier, is when you arrive in a new Malaysian team, of a management team, for example, and you realize that as the boss, you are the only one to drive and never been challenged, because the rest of the team just respect you and do not criticize your proposals, the actions you are taking for the leadership of the company. It's quite a shock, because in the French culture, like we said earlier, there is usually a lot of debate. So I have faced in different companies some management meetings where nobody would ever say anything during the whole meeting. And it takes some time to challenge, it took some time to challenge people to be more reactive and to participate and to build the future of the company, and to make them understand that the boss, as we say, doesn't have all the answers, and that the participation management is very important in the French corporate world, I would say. That's one example. Now I have also another example where more recently I participated in a merger and acquisition where we had a local team who set up a company which was acquired by a French group. And this local team stayed in the company was acquired by the French. And it came a time where investment were required because they wanted to grab a new market. And they were ready to invest. However, HQ said, hold on, we need a business plan. We need a return of investment. We need to understand which customer you are going to target, etc., etc. And it became a really blocking point in the communication between France and Malaysia, because the two teams could not understand each other. The Malaysian team could not understand why suddenly they needed to have so many explanations, while before they were running a business smoothly. And the French did not understand why the Malaysian could not justify why they wanted to have such investment. So, of course, there are different expectations, different way of doing business, and different way to express needs. And I hope that with this seminar, we will dig a bit further into both parties' expectation and understanding. Thank you.
When we talk about culture, and that's what you were sharing, Gilles, it's always a question of perspective and how do we reconcile things. And if you look at these two sides, Malaysians tend to be more on the harmony side, whereas we French are a little bit peppered around those two, but there's a few things that are strongly on the blue side here. So one of the challenge that we face, or question that I find that people working in French organization are struggling with, is our notion of hierarchy. So on the one hand, Malaysia is one of the countries that scores the highest in terms of respect for hierarchy. France, as Frederic will explain, is the country of equality. Yet many of the people who have worked with French are very puzzled by that question.
Indeed, France is a country which the national motto of the French Republic is liberté, égalité, fraternité. So that's freedom, equality, and fraternity. And the French people, you will find, are very much principles based. They like in the work environment and in their life as a citizen, they like to be able to relate to values. They like to know what they are doing and what for they are working. So in this context, definitely, if you add the idea or the ideal of equality and the tradition of critical thinking and debate, you may have the impression that we are sharing as equal partners in a work environment and there's no hierarchy. That's where the difficulty comes in, because the hierarchy exists, it is there, and it is respected just like anywhere else in the world. There's no organization that works without hierarchy. So it's quite important when you want to fit in a French environment to have those elements in mind. Being critical and being able to participate in a debate, being able to consider the other as your equal, doesn't prevent you from respecting the idea that someone is going to make the decision ultimately, and someone is the boss. That needs, probably people need to find the right balance in between these elements. And I admit that it may not always be easy.
Any tips on that particular one? Because I think the main difference between Malaysia and France in here is that Malaysia is very explicit in its hierarchy. You come in and you kind of know where you stand. In France, even as a French, I can be confused sometimes. So how do you know where you stand with your French colleagues?
Look at the organigram of your company. I think that's where you stand. It's not so different from the perspective of organization. But I would go back to my earlier suggestion. You will find your way by being in dialogue, accepting to have this conversation with others, but also by respecting the order of things in the structure. I will add just one historical element here. You know, France is a republic. We had a great revolution in 1789 where we supposedly tried to get rid of all differences between people and introduce this idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But we keep also in our system the former monarchy and the former system where the king was the sole decision maker. And you will see that in the political institutions in France, which are absolutely hierarchically centered on the French president of the Republic. And you will find this also in organizations.
I like the fact, Frederic, that you went back to history, because it's so important. It's also one element of French culture where we like to have historical, cultural references that can be sometimes disconcerting for non-French working in French organization, because they can feel very much isolated from certain conversation, not having that that background and that knowledge. So maybe one tip here for everyone in the room: if you have to work with French company, getting to read and learn about France in general will be very helpful. To understand the kind of references that Frederic just did. Gilles, your take on that topic?
Yes, I would take it just a bit further on topics such as titles and even age versus equality. For us, probably equality is more important than these two topics. So we wouldn't address somebody older or younger differently in an organization, or we wouldn't address a dato or a tenku differently in our organization. Because equality is part of the way we are educated. So it can be shocking for Malaysians sometimes to see that we would seek or respect at the same level a junior and a senior in the organization. But since they are at the same level in the organization itself, for us, it doesn't make sense to treat them differently, for example. We understand that the notion of group is very important here, while on the French side, we are more speaking about the individual. That goes even into our unions, for example. We have who have difficulty to group together in France. They are very dispatch with different ideas. And maybe here the unions are much more collective as a group when they negotiate with companies. But standing out as an individual will make your career, because you will be spotted. You need to gain the trust of your manager, that you take your own initiative and that this manager can trust you, and that he doesn't have to check your job all the time. So you don't blend, and you cannot blame your team. If you work as a group, you can always say, okay, we work together and sorry, we failed because it was a joint group work. What we are looking for is people who drive things and who initiate and bring things to the end. So one-to-one targets are much more important to us than a group objective.
I'd like to add something actually, because we've been talking so far about critical thinking a lot and the value of it in the French value system, but I would add creative thinking. Right? Critical thinking is on the sort of destructive side of things. It's the way you dismantle ideas and try to understand them from the inside, but maybe destroy them at the same time. In the French system, I think individual staff members are also expected to be creative, to bring new ideas. And this is highly valued as well. Each time you will have good ideas, new ideas, they will be welcome, provided here again that you respect the discussion and that you don't go ahead without having passed through sort of validation from your hierarchy. Then creative thinking is also the balance to critical thinking that we're expecting.
I think that's a really interesting point, that echoes what Gilles was saying earlier with your example of the two French and Malaysian team not really communicating properly. But that's something I've heard a lot again in Malaysians team working with the French here. There's a lot of frustration when saying, well, we have ideas, but we are not listened to. People do not really take us seriously. And I think that's connected to what you just explained, Frederic. It is the innovation with the critical thinking that goes behind. If you want to be taken seriously, you need to be able to enunciate your idea fairly in a structured manner.
Yes, that's also one of the results of my little opinion poll with my colleagues here. They said that at the beginning, when they started working in the French embassy, they were amazed with the length of emails that we write. And it reflects, I think, the feeling, the temptation for the French people to be very thorough and articulate and to express fully what they think. And it's a way of expressing yourself, which is also quite valued, being able to spell out everything, put everything on the table for people to look at.
And I think that's a really topic of frustrations for many Malaysians. Why do we need to go through all these explanations?
In our education, we never face, all along our education, we never face multiple choice answer, for example. We have to make our own answers for things. So that's also maybe why we need to go in much more lengthy justification.
Well, that leads me nicely to my next topic on our implicit way of communicating as well. So again, culture is always on a spectrum, and some people here in, as you were saying, Frederic, find the French very direct in how we give our feedback, but yet at the same time, there's a lot of things that remain unsaid or as I said, implicit. So what would be your advice here to non-French in order to decode and best communicate with the French?
I think it's going to be difficult to spell out something that will be useful for everyone. Don't forget one thing, which is, yeah, the French people share a common culture, but you will also be faced with different individuals, with different ways of seeing the world, of expressing themselves, of listening to you. So there's probably no one size fits all. One of the things that you will find interesting, though, is that most of the time, the French people will be interested in the culture around them as well. So they will be, most of the time, relatively open and to foreign cultures. The French people you will find in Malaysia have decided to come to this country and to expatriate themselves. The number of French expatriates has grown a lot in the past 20 years. We had 1 million French expatriates across the globe 20 years ago. We now have 2 million. And in the same 20 years, the number of French expatriates in Asia has been multiplied by 3. It shows that there is an attraction for the French people to understand, to live abroad, and to understand these places. And when you look at the French tourists in a country like Malaysia, what they go to first is culture, heritage, nature. They want to understand. So that may be a good way of connecting and communicating with your French colleagues, to share also some of what you have in mind, not to just feel taken aback by their reactions, but also by explaining why you would react differently. I think this is something that they will be open to, accepting the cultural differences, but also help them understand what difference there is.
Fully agree with that. I think silence is the worst, meaning I think the French are open to criticism because they have been educated this way, and they are willing to take criticism based on how they behave or understand better how they should adapt to the local culture. And what I could add is that, as an advice, is that food, meals, lunch times are very important in a French organization because it's like an extension of our meetings, and we continue to debate about not only politics, but also what's happening inside the organizations during lunch. So I see also a big difference here because in Malaysia, we tend to have just a very quick lunch, very quiet, and then we go back to work. Lunch is a place for debate in our culture. And lunch at work could be used also to discuss about such topic we just spoke about. So I would recommend that you try as much as possible to invite your manager, your boss, whoever, to join you for lunch and vice versa, in order to create this informal platform of sharing and communication.
That's a very interesting point, because I found, again, with organizations I worked with, there's I do find there's a misalignment between expectations around lunch. Malaysians love their lunch and also will spend time, but it's seldom a place for serious conversation. And that's where there's often a disconnect. I remember a particular client, which advice I gave, exactly that, the ones you gave: go and have lunch with your Malaysian colleagues. And a few months later, he said, but nobody wants to eat with me. And when I checked with the Malaysian, they said, well, he almost has an agenda of what he wants to talk about during lunch. I want to talk about my laksa. I want to talk about family. So that is an interesting point. And that goes back to what Frederic was explaining. And that's often the paradox that people dealing with French people struggle with, is our need for reasoning and structure, and at the same time, our need for being social. And the two do not conflict necessarily. Same thing, I do have people working with the French who are very uncomfortable with the debate, the confrontation that we have in meeting, and often don't understand why we still can go for coffee afterwards. In Malaysia, it's often like a break of the relationship. So what would you advise Malaysians to handle that?
Well, it's just the challenge is to find this balance. Like you mentioned, it cannot be a one-way discussion. The, the, the Malaysian also have to feed with some topics which might not be the one expected by the French colleague. It can be about food because food is a culture for both, I would say. But even local politics, the French are usually very interested about, like the Malaysian. It has to be a blend about serious topics linked to the business operation and also what's happening in Malaysia or in France.
I quite agree with the idea that Marie you talk about, which is the paradox. There is a paradox in the French people in the fact that at the same time they like life a lot. They developed a sort of what we call l'art de vivre, the art of living, and they are very into making sure that the food is good, that the art is good, that they're going to enjoy music and whatever, the holidays as well, of course. So there's this idea of an art of life. And at the same time, people are maybe often surprised that the French people are quite serious. They like to be serious. And they actually will also be serious with the art of life, which is not a joke. And the reason and the consequence of us investing so much seriousness into our art de vivre is that we built it into something which is part of the competitiveness of the country. This is because we're serious in the art of life that we have so many luxury brands and that we are so attractive for tourism, for example, and that the French cuisine is so world famous. The French people are quite serious, generally speaking. So don't be surprised if over lunch, not only light subjects will be discussed, but also quite tough discussion can take place. I'll go back to a very basic suggestion there, which is just relax, because it's normal that you will find moments in any multicultural environment, that you will find moments where things are not going to be fully comfortable, where things are going to be different between you and your colleagues coming from a different culture. And we have to accept this at some point, and to accept part of this, I think, to feel comfortable.
Despite some feeling that we might be arrogant or rude or whatsoever, we are curious about other people's cultures. So it is discussion which are very easy to take to.
And that maybe echoes some comments I've seen in the chat, that we take a serious approach in how we understand culture, which might become very cognitive, and we might miss out sometime on the relational part of it, on the sincerity and on the heart. It's more the head sometimes.
The first one I would say is to find a middle ground. So you are joining a French company. That means you are also joining an organization which has a certain culture, which is not the local culture. So as much as an organization who venture into Malaysia, a French organization venture into Malaysia, has to adapt to the local environment, you cannot expect that everything will be done the way it's done in a Malaysian company. So everybody has to make a step. So for Malaysian joining a French company, you have to accept that there will be some cultural adaptation necessary also, as much as the French have to understand there has to be some cultural consideration on their side. So that's one. So the corporate culture will never be fully Malaysian anymore, or in a French Malaysian organization, I would say. Second is what I was saying maybe earlier, make full usage of coffee breaks and lunch breaks to discuss with your French colleague. And the third one, which our ambassador might not be happy with what he was saying earlier, is that insist on everyone speaking a common language. Because there is nothing more rude and frustrating, and I have faced that so many times, that as soon as we have two French together in the organization, suddenly it switched to French, and all the others around are not there anymore. So it is your duty as Malaysian not to be shy and to say, hey guys, here we have decided that in this company, everybody speaks English so that we can understand each other. So let's stick to that and remind them. And they wouldn't be offended. It's just that they tend, for whatever reason, to forget and to stick back to their root language, to their mother tongue. And that's very important because it would remove a lot of tension if you also insist on this language issue, because that's probably the most common one we face when we work here. That, having said that, it goes both ways. That also means not switching to Chinese or Tamil or Malay in front of the French when there is something to say. But I would say the French tend to do it more than the Malaysian. And to push it further, in some of my organization, I even put a coin box where when we were caught speaking the non-English language, we would have to put a coin in a box and have a meal together all together when the box is full.
So that's a tip for you to implement in your organizations. Thank you, Gilles.
All right, so my 3 tips to work harmoniously with the French would be: first, talk a lot, communicate more than you would in an entirely Malaysian organization. It's important. It's valid for all multicultural environments. But in the French context, it's even more important. Talk a lot, communicate. If possible, with a bit of French in it. So if you can learn even one or two words, that will always come very handy and useful. My second tip is, remember the motto I talked about, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Because by remembering this motto of the French Republic, you will remember 2 things. First, that the French people are very much values-based. And that is quite important if you want to understand their way of acting and reacting. And secondly, by remembering that this French motto of the French Republic, you will also remember that there is a difference in culture between you and them, and you will maybe accept a bit more that sometimes it's going to be complicated because of this difference. All right, now my third tip is, definitely go out for lunch with your French colleagues from time to time. Don't try to invite them for karaoke, because they like to eat, but they cannot sing most of the time, and they will feel very bad. That's it, my 3 tips.
Thank you very much, Frederic.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, Marie, for inviting me. I have worked with Alcatel for 19 years and also spent 2.5 years in Paris. I had a big culture shock when I first went to France because that was in 1993. Not many people can still speak English, right? Everyone in the office is all French. And even the manual was in French. Most of the French people are quite friendly, but the problem is always about language. So language and culture is very important. Those that can speak English, most of the time they are quite curious to learn about your culture. But for those that cannot speak English, then they shy away completely, right? So for those that can speak a bit of English, they are very friendly, to all of us. When we first went there was about 12 of us. So those that can speak English, we normally will go out together in the weekends. But those that cannot speak, then they are very quiet and they shy away. The advantage for a few of us who manage to learn French, we can get, to know more, to build our network there. So my advice for Malaysians, I know it's difficult sometimes to learn French, but you will always have the advantage. If you start with a few French words, then automatically, the people become more accommodative and more friendly towards you. So that's one. The second culture shock I had was unions. I was shocked that in Alcatel, the company actually paid the union members to do union work. And their job is only about union and not about work. That was another shocking thing for me. And the third one is that the working hours. Another shocking thing for me is that the French is so strict, about the number of hours that you can work a week. Because I guess the unemployment rate is higher and you want everyone to have a job, and that, you make sure that by 5 o'clock, the office is shut down, but that was many years ago, right? Things have changed. When I go back to France now, I see that a lot of the younger folks, they can actually speak English. It's much easier. So the tips from me is that if you want to work in a French organization, I think at least take some basic French lesson, because it's so difficult. I can tell you, the minute you go into a conversation with a group of French, they will automatically speak French among themselves and they will ignore the people around them. Yeah, and for people who cannot speak French, then you felt so lost. You felt that you are totally kept out of the group. You are not part of the group anymore. I don't know when that can change, but I guess, I still see this quite often.
Thank you, Pauline, for sharing that. The other thing I'd like to point out from what you were saying, it's the notion of how little, the working hours in France. And that's another of the French paradox, because people see us as always on holiday and being very strict on our 35 hours a week. Yet France is one of the countries with the highest productivity in a sense, and the notion of performance is also very important.
Two things I would like to add from Pauline. Yes, not in all organizations you finish at 5 o'clock. I think French, especially at the management level, have a tendency to work quite late in the evening, because you have a split between those who have the punching card and who are by hours, and those who are in the management level who are not controlled by hours. So from my experience in the management level, usually we tend to work quite late. However, there is a very clear split between working time and private time. So yes, on weekends, we wouldn't work usually. And to bridge with here, I think it's the same here. Your boss don't want to be disturbed on weekend with your emails and your WhatsApps if it's not an emergency. While here we used to work all the time. If there's something to do, we do it, right? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
So welcome to the Naval team.
Hi. Yeah, okay, my name is Fazli and I'm one of the local engineer for Naval Group Malaysia. So, like Mary already explained earlier, the local engineers here, we are in our 4th year working with the Naval Group Malaysia. So, what we found interesting working with the French people in our group, especially because for us, they have this willingness to share their knowledge. Those French people that come here, they are expert. They have very high knowledge in their fields, and for us, the local engineers, we just need to ask them to help when we have something to gain more information regarding some particular topic. Secondly, I think working with Naval Group Malaysia compared working with a local Malaysian company is Naval Group Malaysia, for me, they really take care of the wellness of the staff. For example, when we need to go outside of the Kuala Lumpur to go to the client site. The company provide us a dedicated car and everything. So this not something this not a common practice in Malaysia. I think by taking care of this small thing, we can feel like the company is really taking care of your wellness to make sure you perform well on your job. Last but not least, I think the main how to improve and the tips for working with the French is basically the clear communication, because like everything can be solved if we have a proper communication and very clear both way communication. If you have some issue with regarding something, we just need to go to that person, talk, and explain our dissatisfaction for to make sure the other side know our issue and try to resolve it. And I think this is what we in our group try to do, and we are doing it quite well.
Thank you very much, Fazli. There are two things that are important in what you said. One is the wellness of the people, something that comes out a lot. You do have that social connection and that people are taken care of. The other element, which we actually didn't cover, although it was on my list, is that what you mentioned in terms of the need to reconfirm and clarify instructions. French people are not often known for being the best at giving clear instructions. People are expected to find their ways. That led to your comment, Fazli, on the importance to go and clarify what is expected of you.
I think it relates also to our shyness in language. Sometimes we have difficulty to express exactly what we want from the French to the English, and this can create a bit of confusion and maybe inaccuracy and what are our expectations on some of the things we are asking. And therefore it's very important, like you say, to not to be shy, to ask to repeat or to clarify some missions. And usually this is where I find the Malaysian not so open and rather shy to ask, even if they have not really understood what was asked from them.
Thank you very much. I would answer to a few points. First of all, the English-speaking problem of the French, as raised by Pauline. In France itself, apparently, it is slowly improving as compared to the time when Pauline was there a few years ago. French people are gradually learning the language a bit more, the English language a bit more. And I hear from friends who are going as tourists in Paris that it's easier now to have a conversation, at least to order something in a cafe when you speak English. The second point on the working hours, actually the French people work a lot nowadays, and they were well beyond the time that they're supposed to, in particular in big companies and at management level, definitely. And even in the administration and civil service. Because we want to keep some time for ourselves, the level of productivity per hour work is very high. It's one of the highest in the world. If you compare the GDP per hour worked between France and other countries, you'll find that the GDP per hour worked in France is 50% higher than in Japan and 100% higher than in Korea, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So that shows to you that actually the level of productivity per hour work is very high. And that also translates into something which is clear. The companies are quite demanding. They have high expectations towards their staff members. And quite rightly, the staff members have high expectations towards the companies. And therefore, companies know that they need to take care of their staff if they want to keep them. The result of this is that usually the French staff of a company are quite loyal to that company. They're going to work for this company for a long time. They're not going to hop on and off or change companies very often. They are ready to invest in loyalty towards that company. And that's part of the picture also. And finally, a last word on communication and the difficulty of it. I think it's very important to never underestimate the difficulty of understanding each other, even when we speak the same language, but even more when we speak different languages and when we come from different cultures. Never underestimate the difficulty of understanding each other, and never take for granted that you are understood or that you have understood. And you know, some people think that now diplomats like me are not necessary anymore because we've got a globalized world where everybody talks to each other in the same language. But I find that probably one of the last important, useful elements of what we do as diplomats is making sure that people understand each other, because very often people think they do, but they do not.
This brings me to one of the chat comment about I have the experience with an expression from a French saying, "Of course, I'm always right because I am a Frenchman." French humor is part also of some miscommunication because we have a special humor and it's not always understood. And typically, this answer here shows that this person was probably not serious about saying that, but it was interpreted seriously.
Another question came that touching on the arrogance of French people in terms of Malaysia not always feeling trusted and respected by their French counterpart.
I think as far as the idea of not being trusted or respected is concerned, this also sometimes may be related to the way we debate and the necessity sometimes to push a bit your arguments, to be able to convince a bit more. And it's a fine line not to cross, to be able to, you know, give another argument, give another reason why you think your idea is good before it can be trusted and respected. So once again, understand that the French will need to have a bit of a debate.
What advice would you give then to Malaysians in order to build trust and earn the respect of French people?
You need to explain also, you know, the French people you will bump into or work with in Malaysia are they are a minority in this country. They're outsiders, they don't know everything, and there's a lot that they do not know about Malaysia, about the context, about the environment, about the culture of the place. And they may do things or say things that are disregarding the reality of the place because they don't know it. So maybe explaining to them the why and the context is a good idea.
I would rather speak from my personal experience than what I would expect from local partners, local employees, is some characteristics which are close to the way we behave, like anticipation. We anticipate a lot in France. We try to foresee what's going to happen in an organization, the risk and so on, which is not something natural here. But when you identify somebody in an organization who has this capability to anticipate risks, you spot this person as a high potential in Malaysia because it's close to the way you are thinking. And so those persons would have probably a fast-track career compared to others if they come with idea and discussion about risks, for example, and not letting things happen and trying to firefight after.
On the trust between French people, I was quite struck looking at the word cloud that you showed at the beginning, and that comes from the participants' ideas about the French. I was thinking to myself, of course, there were a few so negatively oriented visions there, like arrogance, which often come. But there were also a lot of very positive elements there, and so the positive elements were dominant at the beginning, at least. And I was thinking, yeah, no, there's more and more negative as we speak. The negative dimension increases. So I'm not sure this conference is doing any good to our cause. But there are, you know, stylish, romantic, friendly, and all these things. If you had asked the same question to French people, 3 words to describe themselves, it would have been utterly negative. Utterly negative. You would have hardly found anything positive, because part of the national or our cultural psyche is that we are also extremely self-critical. We may look self-important, as I see on this word cloud, defensive, proud, but that's the thing we show to the outside world. To ourselves and between ourselves, we are very uncertain about our future. We are very much in doubt and very much dissatisfied with our global collective performance. And I think the idea of performance is very important, actually, going back to the idea of how to build trust. You will be judged by the quality of your performance, and by what you bring to the organization, and by what you bring to the collective organization, I think a lot. So being nice to your boss is not enough. You will be judged by the performance, I think, a lot. But maybe I'm being a bit naive with this.
No, I think I would tend to agree with you, where people are task oriented, and you need to see to have trust in the competence in order to trust the person. I think for French people. In addition, maybe if I may add here, that the networking is also important. That's a topic we did not cover, but where you've studied, where you come from, creates, which is very, in that sense, very close to Malaysians, where the people you know will be important in how you get things done.
Governance is one, leadership is another one. As we are here in Malaysia more in the group spirit, I guess it's difficult for somebody to stand out as a leader and to lead a group. However, this is one of the qualities we are looking for as well. Is somebody who can convince a team in the direction to work. Somebody local. Because of course, us as foreigner, we don't have all the recipes to motivate maybe the local teams. And therefore, it's important to find local staff who have this ability to perform, but also to be good leaders to their peers.
I will close the conversation here. Thank you very much for all the people who attended. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Fazli and your colleagues. Thank you, Gilles and Frederic. Maybe, Frederic, I'll leave you le mot de la fin.
Thank you so much. Le mot de la fin has to be a few words to finish with. First, the French Republic's motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I think that's a good one, close to our hearts, and it will maybe remind you of some of the elements we discussed today. And really, I'm happy to have taken this time. I hope we didn't go into too many cliches. I think we still need to keep in mind that there are a lot of individuals and that we all react differently, even if we come from the same culture. And that even between French people or between Malaysian people, you still have the need to discuss and to share and to talk a lot. And therefore, I'll stop here by saying something which only ambassadors do, and which is vive la France, vive la Malaisie, et vive l'amitié entre la France et la Malaisie. Friendship between France and Malaysia. Long live.
Thank you very much, Frederic, for this nice conclusion. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening. Bonne soirée.